Phil, really enjoyed that interview, Mirabai Starr. I know you have more familiarity with her than I did, but I was fascinated with what you had to say, and I'm very excited and looking forward to reading her book.
Yeah, it's a good one, and I would recommend it to people who just want to read a very interesting spiritual memoir, but also especially for people who have may have suffered a loss similar to Mirabai's tragedy and may find some guidance and inspiration in it.
Yeah, it's fascinating background. Her parents moved out of New York. They were very much social activists, and then they moved to an intentional community, which seemed to honor all spiritual traditions. Whereas many of the intentional communities that have to do with spirituality that I'm familiar with usually revolve around one particular spiritual group, one religion, and are not necessarily so open-minded about others, and that can be unhealthy in many ways. Whereas I think her exposure to the Lama Foundation and all gave her, a very eclectic background and a respect for various traditions.
Yeah, and I don't know the extent to which it was an intentional community in the usual sense of the word, where people get together and buy property, build homes, share foods and expenses and all that. And it may just have been a more spontaneous gathering of people around the Lama Foundation and the Neem Karoli Baba Temple in Taos, and the person of Ram Dass, who was a very important figure in that world and at the Lama Foundation and so forth. And I mean, the publication of Be Here Now was originally done by the Lama Foundation. So, but that said, it would have been the kind of open-minded and freedom encouraging uh, world that Ram Dass and other people
Hmm.
of the 60s and 70s would have represented. So it's not surprising, but it is, as you say, unusual because most spiritual communities are around a particular teaching or tradition or guru or whatever.
Right. If our listeners that are not familiar with Nareem Karoli Baba, tell us a little bit about him.
He was a very private guru saint figure living in his remote part of India. When Ram Dass, at that time, Dr. Richard Alpert, formerly of Harvard, went to India and was led to meet Neem Karoli, and to his surprise, became a devotee of his and sort of took him on as his guru. And that, under his influence, became Ram Dass. And when he returned, this is the late 60s, became an important spiritual figure and proponent of the yogic tradition and the teachings of, the Vedantic of perspective and yogic practices and meditation and chanting and so forth. And, Ram Dass got very popular, had a lot of people around him, and many of them went to India to meet Ram Dass's guru. And so for a few years' time, suddenly Neem Karoli became very well known. And a lot of the devotees around him in those few years before he passed away went on to live, to become spiritual leaders themselves and live exemplary lives of service because he was all about service. And so some of them gathered around Taos, and there's a lovely temple there dedicated to Neem Karoli and so forth.
When did you first meet Mirabai?
Oh, we met at a conference just a couple of years ago. And we're very like-minded, and we stayed in touch. And I visited her in Taos when I was there, and I consider her a friend and colleague in interspiritual adventures.
I, I especially like, and it was new for me to hear actually, but it makes a lot of sense. The difference between interspiritual and what was the other, where different groups sort of just who have very specific beliefs begin to interact with each other. Interspiritual seems to mean more people that are totally open-minded and willing to embrace everything and anything that is of interest and looks good to them.
Yes, and I think that's a growing trend. You know, this category in religious surveys and poll taking of spiritual but not religious um, is the fastest growing constituent or category in American religious or spiritual life. And people who would identify with that term
Hmm.
are often very eclectic in their seeking. They don't want to be
Right,
pinned down to anything, and
right.
it's and the accessibility we now have to all these teachings is extraordinary. And so, why not learn from all of them and be nourished by all of them?
Yeah, no, it's exciting. It's and it's like you said, it's nourishing. Whereas when you hear interfaith dialogue, that's nice, but it's usually somebody that has a very specific groups that have very specific beliefs that are now willing to talk to each other, maybe learn a little bit here and there, but they're really holding on very strongly and almost desperately in some cases to their beliefs and
Right.
not totally open. So I think this is an evolutionary step in terms of spirituality for the masses.
I agree, and I agree with your assessment that it's an evolutionary step. I was ordained an interfaith minister, about 15 years ago, and I've been to a lot of interfaith gatherings and dialogues, and it's as Mirabai described. I always describe it as a sort of an extended version of a setup for a joke. Priest, a minister, and a rabbi walk into a room. And so now maybe there's a Swami and a Buddhist Lama or something in addition to those three. But it's usually
Hmm.
that. And it's useful and it's very good. I don't want to disparage it. People coming together
Right.
who are strongly identified with a religious tradition in a spirit of open mindedness and mutual respect and learning. It's a very good thing. But it doesn't necessarily go deep. And so there's a lot of people who, in that same spirit of openness, want to take it a step further and go a bit deeper into the sort of experiential core of these teachings and not just talk about what people believe in or what their view of history or God is.
Right. I think a lot of that even started with some of the people like Thomas Keating that not just only listened to people from other faiths, but actually started engaging in some of their spiritual practices. And I think it's evolved from there. But
I agree, and it goes even further back in Keating's own Christian tradition to Thomas Merton,
hmm.
and I would refer people to our interview with James Finley, where we talk about his relationship with Merton and Merton's influence.
Yep, absolutely. Interesting, and that was another fascinating um, perspective from somebody who was a Trappist monk. Phil, another great session. Our website again is spiritmatterstalk.com. Our podcast, Spirit Matters. I'm Dennis Rundy. My co host, Phil Goldberg. His book, one of his books, American Veda, I highly recommend. Uh, Till next time, Phil.
Yes, sir. Great, Dennis. This was a good one, as they all are, and we'll see you next time.